Character narration and narrative as rhetoric. The approach includes the following key ideas. First, narrative itself can be fruitfully understood as a rhetorical act. Somebody telling somebody else on some occasion and for some purposes that something happened. In fictional narrative, as I have emphasized throughout the analysis of Barbecue, the rhetorical situation is doubled. The narrator tells her story to her narratee for her purposes, while the author communicates to her audience for her own purposes, both that story and the narrator's telling of it. In non-fictional narrative, the extent to which the narrative act is doubled in this way will depend on the extent to which the author signals her difference from or similarity to the I who tells the story. Second, my conception of narrative as rhetoric assumes the possibility that different readers can share similar experiences, and it locates meaning in a feedback loop among authorial agency, textual phenomena, including intertextual relations, and reader response. In other words, for the purposes of interpreting a narratives, the conception assumes that texts are designed by authors in order to affect readers in particular ways, that those designs are conveyed through the language, techniques, structures, forms, and dialogic relations of texts, as well as the genres and conventions readers use to understand them, and that reader responses are a function, guide, and test of how designs are created through textual and intertextual phenomena. Methodologically, this view of the relationship among author, text, including the narrator, and reader means that the interpreter may begin the interpretive inquiry from any one of these points on the rhetorical triangle, but the inquiry will at some point consider how each point both influences and can be influenced by the other two. My own typical method, which I have followed in the discussion of Barbecue, is to start with the textual phenomena. Third, this conception of the recursive relationship among authorial agency, textual phenomena, and reader response entails the possibility of shared readings among different flesh and blood readers. The author designs the textual phenomena for a hypothetical audience, what I call the authorial audience, and the individual rhetorical reader seeks to become part of that audience. When I start the task of interpretation with my readerly response, I seek not simply to find support for that response in the text as constructed in this way, rather than that, but to also test that response by considering other ways of construing the text and comparing the adequacy of the different understandings. Rhetorical reading acknowledges that individual readers will find some authorial audiences easier to enter than others, and it stops short of ever declaring any one reading as definitive and fixed for all time. But it assumes that one significant value of reading narrative is the opportunity it offers to encounter other minds, that of the author who has constructed the narrative and those of other readers also interested in shared readings. For these reasons, throughout this book, I will often use the first-person plural pronoun to refer to the activities of the authorial audience. Fourth, as I noted earlier, the rhetorical act of narrating entails a multi-leveled communication from author to audience, one that involves the audience's intellect, emotions, psyche, and values. Furthermore, these levels interact. Our values and those set forth by the narrator and the implied author affect our judgments of characters, and sometimes narrators, and our judgments affect our emotions. The trajectory of our feelings is itself linked to the psychological, thematic, and as we shall see, ethical dimensions of the narrative. These considerations underlie my attention to the poignancy of the lyric revelation in Barbecue. Fifth, the principle about the feedback loop among authorial agency, textual phenomena, and reader response comes together with the principle about the multi-leveled nature of narrative communication to give an important place to the concept of narrative progression, my term for the synthesis of the narrative's internal logic as it unfolds from beginning through middle to end, with the developing interests and responses of the audience to that unfolding. Narratives typically proceed by the introduction and complication of instabilities, unsettled matters involving elements of story, typically characters and their situations, and or tensions, unsettled matters involving elements of discourse, such as unequal knowledge among authors, narrators, and audiences, as in mysteries, or matters of different values and perceptions, as in narratives with unreliable narrators. Narratives conclude by resolving at least some of the instabilities and tensions. Narratives that resist closure will leave more instabilities and tensions unresolved than those that seek strong closure. As audiences follow the movement of instabilities and tensions, they engage in many kinds of responses, judging characters, developing hopes, desires, and expectations for them, and constructing tentative hypotheses about the overall shape and direction of the narrative. Furthermore, audiences develop interests and responses of three broad kinds, each related to a particular component of the narrative: mimetic, thematic, and synthetic. Responses to the mimetic component involve an audience's interest in the characters as possible people in the narrative world as like our own. Responses to the thematic component involve an interest in the ideational function of the characters and in the cultural, ideological, philosophical, or ethical issues being addressed by the narrative. Responses to the synthetic component involve an audience's interest in and attention to the characters and to the larger narrative as artificial constructs. The synthetic component is always present because any character is constructed and has a specific role to play within the larger construction of the narrative. But the synthetic may be more or less foregrounded. Realistic fiction seeks to create the illusion that everything is mimetic and nothing synthetic. Or, in other words, that the characters act as they do by their own choice rather than at the behest of the author. Metafiction, on the other hand, foregrounds the synthetic component, making us aware of its own construction. More generally, different narratives establish different relationships among these three components. Some narratives are dominated by mimetic interests, some by thematic, and others by synthetic. But developments in the progression can generate new relations among those interests. Sixth, the doubled communicative situation of fictional narration and even much non-fictional narration. Somebody telling us that somebody is telling somebody else that something happened is itself a layered ethical situation. Any character's action will typically have an ethical dimension, and any narrator's treatment of the events will inevitably convey certain attitudes toward the subject matter and the audience. Attitudes that, among other things, indicate his or her sense of responsibility to and regard for the told and the audience. Similarly, the author's treatment of the narrator and of the authorial audience will indicate something of his or her ethical commitments toward the telling, the told, and the audience. Further, the audience's response to the narrative will indicate their commitments to and attitudes toward the author, the narrator, the narrative situation, and to the values expressed in the narrative. Excuse me. These considerations provide a way of discussing the ethical dimension of the rhetorical communication. Work on ethical criticism has exploded in the last decade or so, and there have been many valuable contributions. My approach, like that of such figures as Martha Nussbaum, Wayne C. Booth, Adam Zachary Newton, and Charles Altieri, starts from the general principle that literature in general and narrative in particular, through their attention to the concrete particularities of human situations and their capacity to engage our emotions, provide an especially rich arena for the exploration of ethical issues. More specifically, my approach has most in common with the work of Wayne C. Booth and of Adam Zachary Newton. Each of them, like me, sees ethics as inextricably connected to narrative. Indeed, Booth emphasizes the pervasiveness of ethics in critical responses to literature, and Newton says that he wants to conceive of narrative as ethics. Each of them moves in his own way from narrative to theoretical treatments of narrative, and then back to narrative. In Booth's case, those theoretical treatments can be found in his own earlier work on the rhetoric of literature. His title, The Company We Keep, and his main metaphor, Books as Friends, grow out of his earlier exploration of the way that writing and reading make possible a meeting of minds between author and reader. The Company We Keep moves beyond Booth's earlier major emphases on the cognitive, the aesthetic, and the emotive aspects of that meeting to the contemplation of how our values are engaged as we read, especially the ethical dimension of desiring as the text invites us to desire, and what the ethical consequences of those engagements are likely to be. The Company We Keep also gives greater emphasis to the communal nature of ethical response, suggesting that the activity of discussing the ethics of texts, what Booth calls coducing, is more important, ethically, than getting the text right. Newton investigates the ethical consequences of narrating story and fictionalizing person, and the reciprocal claims binding teller, listener, witness, and reader in that process. An investigation that leads him to describe three kinds of ethical structure in narrative: the narrational, the representational, and the hermeneutic. Narrational ethics are those associated with the telling. They occur along the line of narrative transmission from author to narrator to narratee to reader. Representational ethics are those associated with fictionalizing person or creating character. Hermeneutic ethics are those associated with reading and interpreting, the obligations readers and critics have to the text. Newton synthesizes work of Mikhail Bakhtin, Stanley Cavell, and Emmanuel Levinas as he does his analyses, borrowing especially Bakhtin's concept of vzhizny, or live entering, empathy with the other without loss of self. Cavell's concept of acknowledging, being in a position of having to respond, and Levinas's concepts of saying, performing a telling, and facing, looking at or looking away. While I have learned much from Booth and from Newton, I do not want to adopt Booth's overarching metaphor of books as friends because it seems too limited, or Newton's idea that narrative is equivalent to ethics because that seems not to recognize all the other things narrative is as well. In one respect, I am trying to go further in the direction that Booth and Newton take, one that ties ethical response to the techniques of narrative itself, as I focus on the links among technique, the signals offered by the text, and the reader's cognitive understanding, emotional response, and ethical positioning. To achieve this end, I have deliberately not followed Newton's example of looking to thinkers such as Levinas, Bakhtin, and Cavell for the ethical categories of my analysis. Instead, I seek to let those categories arise out of the examination of narrative technique and to place as much emphasis on the audience's ethical engagement as on the ethical situations represented in the narrative. To put this point another way, my effort will be to trace how the technical choices of the narrative entail ethical consequences, and to stage my own engagements with those consequences. I do not offer my engagements as definitive or comprehensive, but I do hope that they provide the grounds for what Booth would call a productive coduction. The central construct in my approach is position, a concept that combines being placed in and acting from an ethical location. At any given point in a narrative, our ethical position results from the dynamic interaction of four ethical situations. 1. That of the characters within the story world, how they behave and judge others, is inescapably tied up with ethics. 2. That of the narrator in relation to the telling, to the told, and to the audience. Unreliable narration, for example, constitutes a different ethical position from reliable narration. Different kinds of focalization also position the narrator differently. 3. That of the implied author in relation to the telling, the told, and the authorial audience. The implied author's choices to adopt one narrative strategy rather than another will affect the audience's ethical response to the characters. Each choice will also convey the author's attitudes toward the audience. 4. That of the flesh and blood reader in relation to the set of values, beliefs, and locations operating in situations 1 through 3. Let me illustrate the method by returning to Cisneros' story.